Hello and welcome to another episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Blundell and today I'm back interviewing therapists, encouraging our guests to talk about their views about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. But before I tell you about this month's guests, I want to remind our listeners, if you enjoy the podcast, then please give us a review on your favourite podcast platform or share the links for the podcast on social media or with colleagues, as it really helps to raise the profile of the podcast. This month, it was a pleasure to interview Ellis J. Johnson, who is a psychodynamic psychotherapeutic counsellor and a queer trans man of colour. He delivers training to counsellors in working affirmatively around gender and also delivering training in trans awareness and in anti-racist practice to organisations around the country and internationally. On his website, Ellis states that his work is influenced by spirituality and by Black feminism, taking into account how intersecting oppressive structures in society and throughout history can have an adverse effect on our mental, spiritual and physical health. His work is affirmative of gender, sexuality and relationship, as well as being sex worker affirmative. You can find all of Ellis's details in the episode show notes. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did recording it. Ellis, welcome to the Therapist Connect podcast. It's lovely to have you as a guest.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Peter.
I know we've met before, so I know a little bit about you, but I'm hoping we can get to know each other a little bit better through some of the questions that we've got today. Thanks for coming on and sharing your experience with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's lovely to be asked. Thank you.
So the question that I ask everybody who comes on the podcast, I think people find this quite interesting to know about therapists and where they've come from. What drew you to this as a profession in the first place? Why did you want to become a therapist?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I really had to rack my brains about this one to think a little bit deeper than the kind of the general, this is my upbringing and having mental health difficulties in the family and being really interested in how to navigate those and what was going on beyond a sort of natural curiosity I think that lots of people have. I was trying to think about this question. I remember really specifically being drawn to the idea of not having to be a different person at work than I was at home. So I remember thinking, oh, what an amazing thing to live by your values every day. So live by doing something that you care about and is, I think, helps you grow as a person as well as the person that you're supporting or you're with. And I think I was really drawn to how it seemed that you could be full of integrity, really, as a therapist. You were present, the ideas that I had in my head about it, you'd be present, you're connected, you're doing work that maybe aligns with your values. And I think that's really what drew me to doing this, alongside an intellectual curiosity and fascination. I think for me, I can't imagine a more fascinating thing to do with your time every single day than be with another person profoundly, genuinely, in the most connected way you can be. I just couldn't think of anything more wonderful actually to do with my career, and luckily I still feel that way actually, and I think that still is my experience. I think it's a magical thing to do and to experience. So I think my expectations of the job have been met. I would probably say that.
That's lovely, and it's reminded me that when you were talking about your values being aligned with your work, and I was thinking about the amount of jobs I've done in the past before being a therapist where my values did not align with the job I was doing. The real incongruence and disconnect there for me, and how lucky I feel now to be in this profession and doing something that I love. And then also that, like, the interest each day, like there's a constant process of learning and how exciting that is. And I still feel like I've been qualified for like over 10 years now, but I still have that magic, that excitement, that every day that you're connecting with someone on such a deep level. It's unusual job.
Yeah, it is unusual. It's so unusual, and it doesn't really align with a lot of the expectations of what work should be like, right? Or what work really is, and probably was for me as well before I was a therapist. So I do feel very lucky every single day that I get to do this job. And I always say I don't tend to get, touch wood yet anyway, I don't get like the Sunday blues. It's Sunday and I'm not like, oh, I've got to go to work tomorrow. I'm like, I'm ready. I'm ready for it, and I'm engaged and interested, and that's such a privilege to be able to do work like that.
It's wonderful. Can you tell us then a little bit about your career so far, kind of?
So I qualified in 2016, and I was incredibly lucky because I remember coming to the end of my course. I remember very specifically saying to myself, oh, this is exactly the kind of job that I want. This is what I want to be doing. So I'm a transgender man. I transitioned actually halfway through my course, sort of socially transitioned, started to medically transition halfway through the course. And I remember very specifically saying to myself, I would love to be able to offer free therapy to trans people, trans non-binary questioning people. I thought, that's what an amazing thing. Maybe one day I'll get to do that. And literally about a month later, a job came up at an organisation in London called Spectra, which was offering free therapy to trans and non-binary people. They just set up a couple of months before, and they were looking for a trans therapist. And I was like, oh my God, I've just spoken into existence this perfect job. And at the time, I wasn't aware of anything similar to that anywhere in the country, actually. And I think since some other services have popped up, but as far as I'm aware, that was one of the first. I think perhaps there was Clinic Q in London as well, but I think at that time perhaps they were charging. I'm not sure about that, but essentially it was very rare to find an organisation that was offering that. And I was lucky enough to get that role. So fell into sort of dream job immediately, hit the ground running, was there for a good few years. I was also doing mental health advocacy work for another organisation at the time. So I was doing for LGBTQ mental health organisation. So I was doing things like helping people with their benefits, chasing up doctors, helping them with their healthcare, running groups for people of colour and people with suicidal ideation as well, and doing like a million different things. So if anyone's ever worked, who's watching this, has worked in the charity sector, you probably know that you get hired for one role and you do a million other things as well. So that was a kind of a baptism of fire as well. But it really gave me a grounding of working in the community and really, really face to face with the real lived experience of people. Obviously being part of the community is one thing, and having friends and it is one thing, but working with the kind of intricacies of discrimination, marginalized lives, that really, I think it's really grounded a lot of my work since then, actually. So that was a really, transformative period for me. I ended up doing lots of training as well and delivering lots of training. And then I had a really horrible burnout, actually. So I'd worked really super hard through the course, had these really incredible jobs. I was commuting as well. I was living in Brighton at the time and commuting up to London to work twice a week. And my body just stopped working, essentially. And to cut a long story short, I couldn't work anymore, actually. And it wasn't possible for me to keep up employment. So that kind of pushed me into doing private practice, because I could do however many sessions a week I could physically do at that point. At some points it was maybe 2 or 3 sessions a week that I could find the energy to do whilst I was healing from this burnout. And with many things like that, it turned out to be actually a really wonderful shift for me. I think I probably still would be toiling away in the charity sector for 60 hours a week if I hadn't have become very unwell at the time. And then I've been in private practice since then. So that's 2019 I went into private practice. And I've been in private practice since, working mainly online, solely online. And now I'm moving into also doing more training, offering more training around working with trans and non-binary clients. So it's been, it's a funny thing having to look back, isn't it? Because you keep going and you keep going. But I'm very lucky that I was able to come through the burnout, still healing from that. So I've been incredibly busy.
Yeah.
Like a lot of us are. Right?
It sounds it. There's a few things that struck me there, and one of them was the kind of getting to burnout, but almost a horrible experience. But it sounds like something came out of that. Something shifted for you, and you were able to make changes to stop that from happening, and maybe do some healing from that. And then the other thing I was thinking about was when you were talking about working in charity sector kind of services and support services, and something really resonated with me in terms of before I qualified as a therapist, I did a lot of support work. I worked in third sector organisations and charities and advocacy roles, and how much more I think I learn about kind of social justice and supporting people and people from different backgrounds and stuff like that. And I learned much more doing those roles than I did through my therapy training, actually. So something resonated with me when you were talking about that in terms of the knowledge, I think, that is there in those communities, I think.
Absolutely. And I think you can't really imagine what people's lives are like. It's hard to, it's unimaginable, actually. I think sometimes some of the things that I was supporting people with, you couldn't write, you couldn't make it up, some of the difficulties. And I think, sadly, unless you've been in those situations yourself, and I perhaps even say for me, having burnout and not being able to lift up a kettle to make myself a cup of tea, not being able to go to the shop for a pint of milk, or going and then having to rest for 3 days afterwards, I think unless you've experienced that, it's very difficult to imagine what it's actually like to be disenfranchised, to be vulnerable, to worry that you're not going to have a roof over your head next month. So I think the charity that I work for, that I used to work for, they now do a really wonderful thing called the Human Library. And they do this for some sort of local universities. What they do is they get people in who use the services, and it's actually for trainee therapists. They can have a one-to-one conversation with all these different people. The volunteers are like human books, basically. So you come and sit with them and they tell you a bit about their experience and their life and what they want you to know. So you get to choose which kind of experiences you might be interested in. And it's it seems to have a really big impact on trainee therapists. Truly, and I think if we're going to talk particularly about trans and non-binary experiences, there's so much noise in the media about trans people. It's actually quite rare for people to hear a trans person talking about a trans experience, or to sit down with a trans person and have a chat with them. So whenever I do my training, I always say, you might think you've never met a trans person before. You probably have, but you didn't know it. But if you've never met a trans person before, now you have. And I exist in the flesh, and you can talk to me and ask me questions if you want to. But the chasm, I think, between perhaps people who are privileged or have privilege and those that don't, it's very wide, and it seems to be widening as well at the moment. I think it's invaluable, really, the work it sounds like you've done as well, with actually seeing the day-to-day lives of people who are disenfranchised.
Absolutely. And I suppose one of the things I was thinking about is, as therapists, sometimes, obviously, we work with people who are going through difficulties, but sometimes very marginalized communities don't have access to therapy. And actually, therapists can maybe not be seeing people from those communities. And so might not have an insight or an understanding because they're not doing that work like other types of services are.
Yeah, I think that's there. And I think there's also a question of therapy can only do so much as well. So what happens if someone comes to you and says, I don't have any food in my house and I'm going to get kicked out in a month's time? Therapy can only help with that so much. It's a shame that there aren't more advocacy services out there, really, that are supporting marginalized clients.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you define your therapeutic approach, and has that changed at all since you qualified?
Yeah, so I trained psychodynamically, and that definitely forms the most part of my work, I'd say. I think I've become much less rigid in the way that I work. And I think lots of therapists I know would say the same thing. I become less stressed if I haven't got the same glass this time as I had last time for my water, or become much less concerned, or much less rigid and a bit more fluid, I think. So I'm also aware that I've had supervisors that are integratively trained. I've had therapists myself that are integratively trained. So I think, again, always coming back to the person-centered, the core conditions, I always hold them very closely. And I also think incorporating those other elements of social justice, anti-racist practice, a practice that is, I think, perhaps more, how would I put it? practice that can address the issues of today as well, right? Such as incorporating social justice elements, understanding intersectionality, intersectional oppressions, those kind of things. That is really here in my work as well. And I think also elements of kind of spiritual practice, something that is here for me in a lot of the client work that I do. And it tends to be that clients who are spiritually inclined seem to make their way to me. And we sometimes have this moment of almost coming out to each other as being spiritually inclined in those moments, which is quite interesting. So those elements are there as well in my work. But I think psychodynamic work lends itself really well to the kind of the spiritual realm, to magic, to the unconscious, other things that are happening, which is what I really like about the psychodynamic approach.
It's really interesting, and I don't know if this is an accurate kind of representation, but when you were talking about becoming less rigid, and I was imagining, like, I've certainly done this when first training, kind of clinging to the theory rigidly, this is how it's got to be, and then kind of over time going, oh, actually, gosh, there's other stuff that's out there. Yeah.
It's a lovely feeling to grow in confidence. I can definitely look back and see that I can trust myself more to apply the theory in the right way, but not in a rigid way.
Yeah.
So that's a lovely thing that comes with time, I think, and experience.
Yeah. I love that. So for regular listeners of this podcast, you will have already heard Ellis talk a little bit about this topic already, because we did an interview with some of the authors of the Queering Psychotherapy book that's been out this year. But for people listening for the first time, you are one of the authors of that book. Can you tell them a little bit about it and what kind of motivated you to write a chapter in that book?
Yeah. So I was invited to write a chapter on working alongside trans and non-binary, questioning folks in therapy. And yeah, I think as I said earlier, it's quite rare actually for trans people to be given a seat at the table, for us to be given a voice, and particularly as a brown trans person, a trans man, and being somebody who is working class, from a working class background. There are those three things together: being trans, being brown, being working class, and perhaps even also being a man sometimes in this profession. Sometimes, not always, and being queer as well. All those things together, it's pretty rare for people like me to have a voice, actually. And you might be forgiven for thinking, oh, trans people are everywhere, we don't stop hearing about trans people. But if you kind of tune in a little bit, you'll notice that you're not really hearing trans people talk about trans people. You're hearing cis people talk about trans people with a lot of confidence, but it's very rare you hear trans voices. So a
lot of confidence and very loudly.
Incredibly loudly and very forcefully, and perhaps very convincingly sometimes as well. So for me, I was like, wow, okay, so there's an opportunity, there's a space here for me to talk about the things that I care about, the things that I experience, and also from being able to talk about it as a professional, not just from a lived experience perspective, because that's also often what we hear from trans people. If they're given space to speak, it's about personal experience, it's lived experience. It's about the narrative, the story. When did you know? When did you start taking hormones? When did you have surgery? That's what we hear, I think, a lot of the time. But it is rare, I think, to hear professionals who just happen to be transgender talking about the things that they know about. So I was just really over the moon to be asked. It's just a wonderful project. And yeah, there was so much to say. Oh my God, there's so much to say. But it was really wonderful experience talking with Chance and hearing what Chance had to offer as well. And yeah, I just feel really lucky to be a part of it. Yeah, it's wonderful.
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic book. So if anyone who's not read it, I would recommend going and getting it. And you can hear more from the authors in one of our previous podcast episodes, and a bit more from you, Ellis, as well. So thank you for writing it as well, because it's brilliant. And your chapter's fantastic as well. I really enjoyed it. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the wider therapy community? I suppose we might have touched on that a little bit, and how connected you feel to other therapists.
Yeah, I think, again, as a listener of the podcast, I hear lots of other therapists saying similar things, that it is a very isolating, can be very isolating profession. And I think I would probably say I haven't felt very connected to the profession or to the community that, for a very long time. And I think when it's come about recently, and that's because I've been connecting with other queer therapists, thanks to the book. And also being asked to be a clinical associate at Pink Therapy was a really big honor for me. And so connecting in those ways has been really wonderful. But I don't know that I've always felt there's a space for me with my identities, my background, the way I look, the way I talk, the way I hold myself. And that might be something also for me of training down south. Had I done my training up north, maybe back in Yorkshire, it would be one thing. I trained in trained in Brighton, very white, middle class area. So maybe I set myself up actually for feeling a bit separate. But it has been hard to feel connected and to be, perhaps even to feel accepted, really, and wanted. And as I say, yeah, that changes with finding other therapists who are a little bit like me. And there are lots of them that we are out there. So it's been a little bit difficult, I think. But for me, also trying to create those spaces for myself and other people, that's how I've gotten around it. Starting to deliver training on my own for other people that want to have these conversations around oppressions, class, race, ability, trans identity in there. Started to create the spaces for people who want to have the conversations that I want to have. And again, surprisingly, there's lots of us, actually.
You're right. It's such a common thread through the guests on the podcast of talking about isolation and not feeling connected, but wanting to be. And I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I feel like I've seen the establishment of lots more communities now and groups of people coming together. And I think almost for me, like the next stage is like, can we get all those groups to also connect?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think those conversations are really important. And I think a lot of people want them to happen. And I think therapists aren't always sure how to organize ourselves in groups.
Yeah. I wonder.
That's a bit of a generalization, maybe, but
it's my experience as well. I think I agree with you. And I wonder sometimes if a lot of us are quite introverted somehow and we're more comfortable listening than talking. So you get lots of us together and maybe everyone's sitting back and listening, and it can be a bit tricky, can't it? I think sometimes. So, but it's quite fascinating to know that, yeah, that there are lots of people who care about the same things. In my experience, again, with doing the work around trans inclusion in therapy, the vast majority of therapists I speak to are really desperate to hear more and to understand more from a really affirming position, without the hostility or the cynicism or the critical ear. People are just actually quite welcoming. So if we could, I love your idea of just bringing these groups together somehow. And I think maybe that's got to be the next step for our profession if we want to have longevity. I think in this work, we want the work to be sustainable. We want to avoid burnout, and we also want to make a difference to the profession and keep it moving forward. I think, yeah, there's lots of opportunity for that. We just need someone to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why people enjoy the Therapist Connect podcast, because people are talking about their experiences and we're getting to hear about all these different kind of groups and communities and work that people are doing that's going on, but isn't always necessarily visible, or it might be visible to certain therapists, but not to others. So I think it's just really important that we highlight all this important work that's going on out there at the moment.
Absolutely. There's lots of different ways to be a therapist, right?
Exactly.
So hearing from one another, I think, is really powerful. And yeah, it's been an experience today, looking back and talking about my experience. Really interesting.
Yeah, it's brilliant. What do you think is the biggest challenge that the counselling and psychotherapy profession faces right now?
I think there are lots of challenges. Because I think, not to sound too grandiose about it, but I think the world is changing really quickly, really profoundly. Everything around us is shifting. So I think one of the challenges that perhaps I can land on today is, how do we keep up with that? How do we, I think, particularly incorporating a social justice lens, understanding intersectionality, understanding all these other elements of human experience that might not take as much space in therapeutic spaces as they should, actually. I think that might be the next challenge. And certainly, as I say, the therapists that I speak to, it's like everyone's trying to catch up with, we can think particularly around like Black Lives Matter, for example. And I think these kind of movements, these kind of social justice movements, civil rights movement are coming thick and fast at the moment. So I think therapists want to understand how to keep up with that, how to work with it. And perhaps there's something there also about society being very polarized. And I think therapists are wondering which side of the coin or which side of the fence am I going to fall on? And how do I work with that? There's a kind of an expectation that we're supposed to be very polarized in the world right now. We're supposed to have an opinion about things. I wonder how difficult that is for therapists to hold all that shift and change and not be defensive about being called out for being racist, for an example, or this is what's in the ether at the moment. This is what we're swimming in. So I wonder if a challenge is, how do we engage with those conversations when they're incredibly difficult conversations? How do we own our racism when that is incredibly painful, as an example?
And I think part of that is, for me, it can be so fast paced, but it's really important that we actually do have the conversations and don't avoid the conversations, because that's the bigger problem. Yeah, when we're completely avoiding it because it's too scary or there's too much going on, and we're too defensive to engage with that. If we don't have those conversations, then the work's not happening.
To not avoid the conversation altogether, right? To say therapy is a completely neutral space, it's an apolitical space, so that I don't need to engage with these things. And that, I think, can trickle down to the idea that being trans is a political identity. Somehow we've been politicized as a talking point. So I think that can be difficult for therapists to maybe even take seriously, right? There's an idea that we're just a fad and we're causing trouble. But how do you... What is your opinion as a therapist? How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with that in a client? So these are really big questions, I think, that society is asking itself. And I think therapists are not immune to those questions.
And something I was thinking when you were talking was that idea of it's about those specific conversations we're having, not just a conversation, debating people's lived experience or identities, or it's actually really about the conversation with yourself about what are you doing to improve your work and how you can support people.
I think this is the big shift, and something that I'm really keen on in my work is acknowledging that these questions are not just about people out there or your clients, they are about you, because you are also part of society. And so when I offer my training around trans identities in therapy, the first half of the day or the weekend is about you, is about, okay, what is your history with gender? What is turning the camera back round and saying, how about you? You have a gender as well. You have a sexual identity. It's not just people who are othered that have identity. You have an identity as well. And that's tough work. That is tough. That's really tough work. But if you want to engage in a meaningful way with your clients and work in a safe way, I've said it to you on the other podcast, it's a potential for liberatory conversations for all of us in this work. And I think that therapists need to do that work.
I completely agree. When we did the other podcast, we discussed this point a little bit in terms of, I think something in the book that you were writing out is the opportunity for everybody when you start having these conversations. And we had a bit of a discussion about, isn't it just enough actually for it to be for trans people? And one of the things that I was thinking about, which I didn't mention when we had the discussion earlier, was when I'm doing training in university for students and stuff, when you open up this conversation, it opens up a world of opportunity for everybody in the room. Yeah. And people start questioning and reflecting and thinking about different aspects of their identity that they hadn't really connected with before, which I think is, for me, it's a wonderful thing to see. And once you take away that, can't take it away completely, but reduce some of that tension and that toxicity around some of those discussions, and actually people talking from their authentic experience, actually it's amazing what kind of comes out of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's revolutionary.
Yeah.
It is revolutionary, and it's revolutionary because the other big part of my work that I really care about is thinking about white supremacy culture and coloniality and colonialism, and asking the question, how can we undo those things? And so when people recognize that they also have a position in white supremacy, they've been positioned as well. They're not just the center. but they've been racialized as white. They've been told that they are straight if they have certain types of sex or they're attracted to certain types of people. Once we recognize that all these systems work in tandem, it's not a surprise to me that there's a relief. My God, the relief of it, to understand that we don't have to be rigid, that we have space to maneuver, and how wonderful in terms of connecting with other people to acknowledge that they also don't have to be rigid. So there is a freedom for everybody here, and it's huge work. It's taken 400 years to get here.
And the dismantling of a system and a culture or multiple systems and cultures is amazing, and fluid and freeing, but can also be really scary for people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about it very particularly in sort of therapeutic terms. We're giving up familiarity. We're giving up incredibly ingrained senses of self that have been ingrained on purpose for 400 years. This is the kind of person you are. This is how to be a person. This is what a body should look like. This is how a man should act. This is how a woman should act. This is race, the construct of race, very particularly on purpose. There's a lot that we have to sacrifice, but there's a lot more to gain. But it's really profound work, and it's very emotionally charged, and it's very confusing for lots of people. So that's the kind of work I like to do.
Amazing. Sounds great. Ellis, I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been really interesting. I suppose my final question is, what plans have you got for the future? I know you've got some training coming up, which you might want to tell us a little bit more about.
Yes. I've decided to, as we said earlier, create space to have the conversations that I want to have with people and to learn the things that I'm interested in learning. So I've created, it's a 3-part course. I've titled it Gender Expansive Therapy. And the reason it's expansive is that we are not just talking about gender, but we're also talking about race, class, age, ability. We're breaking apart the sort of white supremacist oppressive structures and engaging in the bigger question of decolonial work, which is something that I'm really excited by. So how do we decolonize therapy? How do we decolonize gender, sexual diversity, relationship diversity? I'm really interested in moving these conversations forward from talking about toilets and pronouns, which are absolutely important. They have their place. But I want to, again, it sounds like a big ambition, but I want us to be talking about these things in a much broader, bigger way, understanding them through a colonial lens and doing something to undo that. So as I say, the course is in 3 parts. The first part is working with expansive clients. It's just around gender and trans identities, really. The second part is on decolonizing gender, relationship diversity, sexual diversity. And the third part I've entitled Expansion in Practice. And that will be more experiential for therapists to have some fun with their gender, have some fun and explore and expand, and have some experiences that might be a little bit out of your comfort zone in terms of the questions and the provocations that I'll be asking. So we've had the first session already. We had level 1 ran a few weeks ago, and that was really wonderful, really challenging is the feedback that I was getting, really challenging. But somebody said, I can feel my brain expanding. I can feel that my brain's expanded through this weekend, so I can understand why you're calling it gender, expansive therapy, which is really wonderful. And level 1's going to run a few more times. The next one's in February 2024. That's the 10th and 11th. And we'll have another level 1, I think, in April. And then level 2 and level 3 will be out as well. Plenty of opportunities to come along to level 1. And a big ambition for me, as I said earlier, is creating spaces for therapists who are thinking about these topics to come together and meet other people to create community as we go along, keep in touch with one another and support each other in doing this work. So that's a big project for me, trying to decolonize gender in the therapy world. it seems like people are ready for it. So I'm ready too.
Absolutely, people are asking for it, and that training sounds amazing. And to have that feedback, that's what you want from training, is to expand your mind. And it sounds like people are soaking that up, which is absolutely fantastic. And what we'll do is we'll put links to your website and the training and stuff in the show notes so people can get access to that and check it out. So Alice, thank you so much for coming on the Therapist Connect podcast for a second time. And it's been great getting to know you a little bit better and find out more about you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been really lovely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.